Boy is always hungry after being babysat by grandma. His dad discovers a shocking truth. Matthew stood aside. He couldn't risk getting caught. Something wasn't quite right, and this was his only chance to get to the bottom of it. A nagging feeling tormented him, pushing him to discover the truth. Silently, he hurried to an unoccupied table, taking his seat cautiously as he prepared to unravel the mystery. But he would lose his mind as soon as he saw what was really happening. Matthew had a perfect view of his son and mother-in-law from where he was sitting. The child's sad look tugged at his heartstrings, a clear sign something was wrong. However, Matthew didn't approach him or his mother-in-law. But when a waiter came over with the food, Matthew saw a rat. Something wasn't right. When little Mason first complained that he was hungry, Matthew didn't think much of it. He thought his son was going through a period of growth and that it was nothing unusual. For him, this was a problem that could be solved with a quick visit to the fridge. The father didn't realize there was something more at stake. But Matthew had no reason to believe there was anything fishy at play. He believed that grandmothers were the best when it came to feeding babies. If anything, his son should have complained about being too full. Matthew let the matter go, quickly forgetting that it existed, but it soon became a daily occurrence. It began with some inexplicable visits to the kitchen by the child, who rarely went to the kitchen unless it was really necessary. Every night when Matthew came home from work, Mason was in the kitchen waiting for dinner. He scrambled through all the leftovers in the fridge, anxious to find something to eat. At first, it made the man laugh. He watched his son gorge himself as if he hadn't eaten in days. From a bowl of shredded turkey, slices of cornbread and cranberry sauce, to a glass full of juice, the boy devoured all the leftovers from the previous day with a wide smile. But as the cycle continued for weeks on end, Matthew became worried. It definitely wasn't healthy for him to eat so much, right? In the morning, Matthew and his wife Emma served the child a bowl of cereal before going to work. They also left a selection of fruits such as apples, bananas, and mangoes, all of which were high in fiber, to ensure that the son felt full throughout the day. Also, as soon as they left, Emma's mother Lilian took care of the baby. Although Matthew and his wife always left their son enough food for hours, they'd also instructed his grandmother to give him a large meal around lunchtime. But as the days passed, Matthew realized his son seemed always hungry. He began to worry if his mother-in-law was following his rule. Certainly didn't look that way. Days turned into weeks, and the boy kept complaining he was hungry. Every night, he ransacked the kitchen, hoarding all the edible food he found in the refrigerator or pantry. Watching him in silence, Matthew became worried. Suddenly, concerns about his mother-in-law's feeding of his son began to increase. Did Lilian give the child enough food while Matthew and his wife were away on business? Since Matthew has never been one to jump to conclusions, he decided to approach the matter in the best way. One afternoon, he called Lilian and asked her about her son's eating habits. When he asked her if she was feeding him as instructed, the woman assured Matthew that her son was getting everything he needed. But Matthew knew something was wrong. Matthew's concern grew. Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now, back to the story. He began to observe his son with the attention of a hawk. He'd noticed that on weekends everything seemed fine. The boy had a proper lunch and a decent dinner. But during the weeks he was alone with his grandmother, when it came time for dinner, he was already ravenous. As time passed, Matthew and Emma's son continued to behave like this. Every night he would show up in the kitchen looking for something to eat. He complained of being hungry and devoured everything his parents put in front of him with the zeal of someone who hadn't seen food for days. Matthew and Emma became more and more worried about their baby, but they had no idea how dire the situation really was. The situation seemed to get worse as the weeks went by. Matthew, now worried about his son's health, decided to get to the bottom of the mystery. He also began to study his mother-in-law, drawing a map of her activities throughout the day. He suspected she was lying about feeding the boy, but had no idea how to prove it. But no matter how much he investigated, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He sensed no hostility or resentment on Lilian's part toward his son. He'd also noticed how caring she was towards the boy. He thought he'd hit a wall in his investigations. But that all changed on a Tuesday afternoon when he decided to follow his mother-in-law. Matthew had received a message from his mother-in-law. He hurried to open it and read the words, "I'll take Mason to the family pub downtown for lunch." His eyes widened and he rose from his chair. Although he had a good relationship with Lilian, she rarely texted him, but he usually informed Emma of his whereabouts every time he left the house with Mason. "This is my chance," Matthew said as he picked up his jacket. It was the perfect opportunity to understand what was going on. He couldn't explain why Lilian had sent a message to him instead of his wife, but was happy nonetheless. As the hour approached mid-afternoon, Matthew assured his superior that he'd be back in a hurry. Without a second thought, Matthew jumped in the car and stepped on a pedal. He had to see what was going on. The journey downtown seemed to take a lifetime, even though the roads were clear and Matthew was driving at the maximum speed allowed by highway code. The sun was bright in front of him, the wind fresh, but Matthew couldn't enjoy the atmosphere. Throughout the trip, he thought of his mother-in-law and his son. He wondered what he would see once he reached the restaurant. Finally, after passing through the almost non-existent lunchtime traffic, Matthew pulled up in front of the huge family pub. The name of the trattoria shone in front of him. Sweet and savory aromas greeted him as he walked away from the street. Lilian's car was in the parking lot, but he was about to stumble upon a terrible truth. Matthew, who hadn't had lunch yet, had to fend off the smells and the inviting scene. He was here on a different agenda and had to stay the course. He walked slowly into the restaurant, hesitating to show up. If Lilian had known he was there spying on her, she would have caused months of trouble. "Hello, sir, table for one?" a young waitress asked. Matthew knew he couldn't sit down to eat. There was a chance the maid would accompany him to the dining room floor where his son or mother-in-law could see. No, I'm looking for an old lady and a child. She's my mother-in-law, but they can't know I'm here," he explained. The waitress had a suspicious expression on her face as she escorted him into the restaurant. Matthew wanted to stay hidden as he followed the lady to a secluded table. He nodded to her, silently thanking her for agreeing to her request despite it being strange. He couldn't risk getting caught. Something wasn't quite right, and this was his only chance to get to the bottom of it. To blend in completely, he asked the waitress for a small slider of beef and fries. As the waitress hurriedly left, a curious Matthew began to scan the restaurant. He was glad this table has a great view of the whole place. From where he was sitting, he had a perfect view of his son and mother-in-law. He couldn't help but notice the sadness in the boy's eyes. He wondered why the child seemed so miserable. He watched from afar, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Lilian and Mason were waiting for their orders while chatting. Matthew looked intently at Lilian. She seemed as caring as she usually was when he and Emma were around. On one occasion, she even made Mason smile. Matthew couldn't help but wonder if he'd made a mistake. But just then, as he stared at the couple, he noticed a waiter approaching their table with 2 small plates. That's when he saw red. The waitress exchanged a glance with Mason before sliding the plate close to him. Her gaze lingered on him for a few seconds, and his eyes sparkled with pity. Matthew watched wide-eyed as the waiter placed only a side salad in front of Lilian and Mason. The little boy looked extremely disappointed as he stuck his fork into his plate, bringing a piece of cucumber to his mouth. Matthew's molars collided with each other. Why on earth was his son eating such a small lunch? He needed protein and starches. He and his wife had chosen to trust Lilian, yet she was feeding their son a small plate of salad. Why'd you decide to go this route with Mason? Matthew couldn't take it anymore. He scrambled out from his chair, barely able to contain his anger. The waitress who'd taken her order was rushing back with her food, but he didn't care. He approached Lilian and Mason's table unheard, like a grizzly hunter. Mason noticed him first, and his little face lit up when he saw his dad. Lilian was stunned to see his son-in-law. "Matthew, what are you doing here?" she asked. Matthew could barely contain his anger. "Is this your lunch?" he ranted. He'd spent weeks wondering why his son was always hungry. He never thought the reason would be so heartbreaking. "Is that what you gave him to eat? No wonder he's starving." Lilian was in shock at his words. "Starving? What do you mean he's starving?" Lilian asked. Her eyes bounced between her son-in-law and nephew. She seemed to have no idea Mason was always hungry. "I just fed him healthy, low-calorie meals," she said, still amazed by Matthew's outburst. "The last thing we want is for him to end up being sick like me," she explained. Emma's mother, Lilian, had never been a very healthy woman. She was overweight and had a craving for sweets. How many times had Emma tried to dissuade her from her diet, which usually consisted of fried food and sugary sweet? Emma's heart sank when her mother was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Matthew's face softened as she said those words. He looked around, seeing that all eyes in the restaurant were on him. He realized he dealt with the situation the wrong way, raising his voice against his mother-in-law. Suddenly, he felt terrible. Guilt and embarrassment flooded his veins, and he had to sit down or he would have fallen. Lilian had no idea that the child was starving. She was just trying to keep him healthy. Matthew sat down from across his mother-in-law and explained the situation to her, stating that his son was too young to be on a diet. He told her of the many times Mason had devoured everything in the kitchen because he was starving. Lilian felt guilty as he explained all this to her. She had no idea that what she was doing was negatively affecting the boy. Matthew accepted the woman's apology and ordered himself and his son a decent meal while the older woman finished her salad. He told Lilian how glad he and Emma were that she now led a healthy life. They were just as happy that she decided to help them with Mason. He also apologized for his outburst. It had all been a misunderstanding, and at the end of the day, everything was resolved.